That morning, they were just an ordinary family, laughing on the road toward vacation. Hours later, their car was crushed between two trucks, twisted like paper, and to anyone looking from the outside, there was no chance of survival. But inside, at the moment of impact, something invisible enveloped them, and the impossible happened. What saved that family would forever change everything they believed about life and about God. Are there angels among us? July 24th, 2019. It was a cold winter morning, and the kitchen was filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread. The clock showed just past 7 when everyone gathered around the table. On the TV, the news played softly in the background, and between reports, there was mention of a group claiming to have survived an accident by the hand of God. Richard Coleman, with a stern face and a critical gaze, let out a half-ironic smile and muttered, "Always that story. No miracle. Just luck." He didn't speak with anger, but with the conviction of someone who grew up believing nothing exists beyond what the eyes can see. Laura Coleman didn't respond. Sitting across from him, she stirred her tea absent-mindedly. Coming from a simple home where prayers before meals were tradition, she had learned to see God as a presence in everyday life. But the years, the bills, and the rush of life had pushed that habit aside. Now her prayers were rare, quick, and silent, almost like an automatic reflex. She didn't confront her husband, not because she agreed, but because she knew any discussion would end in a stalemate. Still, she held on to small memories of when believing felt as natural as breathing. Ethan Coleman, with headphones draped around his neck, shifted his gaze between his phone and his cup of hot chocolate. Sophie Coleman, with the curiosity of her 9 years, broke the silence. "Mum, is it true that God can save someone from an accident?" Richard was quick to answer. "Sweetie, if a car crashes and someone survives, it's because the seatbelt was on, the car was good, and that's it. No magic." Sophie bit her lip as if she still had doubts, but didn't press further. That kind of topic died quickly in their home. Despite these differences, life seemed harmonious to outsiders. They traveled for vacations, dined out, made plans for the future. But there was an invisible detail that both united and divided them: faith, or rather, its absence as a central element in their home. It was like a locked room that no one bothered to open, but everyone knew was there. Richard believed life was a game of decisions and consequences, controlled only by one's own willpower. To him, destiny was a word for those unwilling to take responsibility. Laura stayed in the middle ground, with the door to faith half open but never fully crossed. Ethan and Sophie absorbed this neutrality without realizing it. There were no bedtime prayers, no Bible stories, no conversations about spirituality. It was a house full of laughter, but where the invisible had no place. That July, they had no idea that just a few weeks later, that locked door would be forced open so powerfully that no scientific explanation could close it again. And when it happened, it wouldn't just be a moment. It would be the exact point where their lives would split into before and after. In Are There Angels Among Us, every video is a journey that moves, inspires, and transforms. Subscribe and turn on notifications to experience each. Miracle with us. June brought the start of school vacation. Exams were over, backpacks were tucked away in a corner of the living room, and a sense of rest seemed to settle over the Coleman household. It was then that the decision was made to take advantage of the break for a family road trip, just the four of them, far from routine and obligations. No appointments, no alarms, no rush, just the road, landscapes, and a few days of relaxation. It was a simple plan, the kind no one imagines could hold anything beyond fond memories. Preparations began casually. The day before departure, suitcases started piling up around the house. Some were open with clothes scattered about, others already closed and stacked by the door. Richard Coleman reviewed the route on his phone, checking the GPS as if preparing for an important mission. Laura Coleman packed homemade snacks, water bottles, and fruit, ensuring hunger wouldn't interrupt the trip. Ethan Coleman, oblivious to the bustle, argued with his sister over who would get the window seat. Sophie Coleman, more excited, kept asking questions about the destination and how long until they left. It was the organized chaos, typical of pre-trip preparations, with a light energy that seemed to promise calm days ahead. On the morning of departure, the house woke earlier than usual. The scent of coffee mingled with the sound of zippers closing and the creak of car doors. Richard loaded the suitcases into the trunk with meticulous care, as if the space were a puzzle. Laura double-checked the bag with documents and the first aid kit. Ethan slid into the back seat with his headphones around his neck, trying to ignore his sister's teasing. Sophie, grinning triumphantly for securing the window seat, pressed her face against the glass as if eager to start the trip before everyone else. It was a perfect snapshot of an ordinary family chasing better days, unaware that the road held something that would change everything. The first few miles were filled with light conversation and minor disputes over the radio. The landscape shifted between open fields and small villages, with the sun filtering through clouds in golden hues. Sophie counted trucks on the road, turning the journey into a game. Ethan, feigning disinterest, occasionally let slip a comment about something he saw out the window. Richard kept a steady hand on the wheel, attentive to the mirrors, while Laura offered snacks from time to time. Everything seemed to fit the script of a normal trip, perhaps too ordinary to be memorable. As they moved onto the main highway, traffic increased. Long trucks, hurried cars, and travel buses mingled on the road, creating a flow that demanded extra attention. Richard controlled the speed, avoiding risky overtakes. On the radio, a soft song created a calm atmosphere, as if that moment were a safe, predictable part of the day. But a few miles ahead, a sequence of events was already taking shape, and no forecast, map, or driving experience could prepare the Colemans for what was about to happen. Before fate changes course, every second feels ordinary, until it isn't. If you've experienced a moment like this, comment, "I've felt this," and let's see how many have lived something similar. The asphalt stretched like an endless ribbon under a crystalline blue sky. The late morning sun's heat reflected off the car's hood, but a light breeze slipped through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of earth mixed with the fragrance of surrounding crops. Richard kept his hands steady on the wheel, sitting upright, his gaze focused, exuding the quiet confidence the others felt without needing to say. It was the kind of road that seemed to invite slowing down life, but also the kind where the unexpected could hide around any curve. In the passenger seat, Laura relaxed, resting her arm on the door, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs pointing to a good lunch stop. The radio's soft music filled the space, until the announcer's voice broke in, "Attention drivers, the road is partially blocked a few miles ahead due to an earlier accident. Slow traffic in the area." It wasn't the kind of news that sparked immediate concern. Accidents, unfortunately, were common on that highway. Still, a brief silence fell over the car, as if everyone absorbed the information. Ethan, slouched in the back seat, made a quick comment about how there's always some distracted driver causing pileups. Sophie, more animated, suggested stopping at a roadside diner they'd passed, imagining they could eat before the traffic slowed them down. Richard agreed it might be best to decide soon, but kept the car moving. The horizon remained clear, with no signs of congestion. That calm was deceptive, almost a disguise for what was already unfolding miles ahead out of their sight. The mood in the car stayed light. Between curves, small conversations popped up about places that reminded them of past trips, jokes about the eye, suspicious food at certain diners, and Richard's habit of always trying to find shortcuts via GPS. Laura checked the snacks she'd packed, while Sophie insisted on opening a bag early. The steady hum of tires on the asphalt gave the trip an almost hypnotic rhythm, as if each mile pulled them further from the real world. But at some invisible point ahead, the road was already being reshaped by chaos. Soon, the first signs appeared. A cargo truck passed slowly in the opposite direction, its bumper dented, the driver's face tense. A few cars followed, slower than usual. It wasn't alarming, but enough for Richard to glance quickly in the rearview mirror and adjust his speed. On the radio, updates mentioned the blocked section again, still vaguely. The sun remained high, the asphalt seemed safe, yet something in the air began to shift. As they pressed on, traffic thickened subtly. Vehicles were closer together, braking gently, drivers peering ahead as if expecting to see something at any moment. Laura started watching the road's edges more closely, trying to gauge if they were nearing the reported area. The chatter in the car quieted, and the soft music that once filled the space now felt distant, like background noise for a scene about to take on a much louder sound. In that moment, no one in the car knew, but fate was already aligning every second. Each overtake, each curve, each glance at the horizon brought them closer to a moment that, to any outside observer, would seem impossible to survive. And while the metal was still intact and the windows clean, Something invisible was already moving toward the Coleman family. Not every storm begins with thunder. If yours started in silence, share in the comments, "I lived this." If you're up for it, add the lesson you took away. Your memory might be someone's shelter today. The horizon began to blur like an out-of-focus photograph. Amid the sun's glare on the asphalt, red dots started flashing with growing intensity. The reflection of brake lights multiplied on the windshields of cars ahead, creating an irregular, almost chaotic sequence. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge the distance, while Laura instinctively braced her hand on the dashboard. Ethan removed one earbud, and Sophie stopped playing with her snack bag. In that brief silence, an unspoken thought seemed to cross the air. Something was wrong. The first visual impact came quickly. A truck a few vehicles ahead slowed abruptly. Its brakes, screeching like an urgent warning. The tires let out a shrill cry against the asphalt, and a faint mist of smoke rose from beneath the wheels. Richard hit the brakes, feeling his body lurch forward, the seatbelt tightening against his chest. The car slowed, but the distance still seemed too short for a smooth outcome. Then, as if time had decided to unfold in slow motion, a deep, distant rumble came from behind. Laura turned to the rearview mirror, her eyes widening. A second truck was barreling toward them, its front tilted as if trying to stop, but with no space left to do so. The mass of metal and cargo defied the physics they knew. The gap between the truck's bumper and their car's rear shrank in an invisible countdown, with no escape. The impact hit like a silent explosion for those inside. From the outside, the sound was deafening. The crack of iron breaking, the scream of glass shattering, the groan of car bodies colliding brutally. The Coleman's car was shoved violently forward. Crushed against the truck stopped ahead. In the blink of an eye, they were trapped between two moving walls, like a book slammed shut on a fragile page. To those watching from outside, it seemed certain nothing alive could emerge. The car's body crumpled in waves, folding like crushed paper. The windshield shattered into 1,000 fragments, scattering like glittering dust in the air. Tires burst, doors twisted, and the hood folded in on itself. It was the kind of scene that made even seasoned rescuers hold their breath before approaching. But inside that makeshift cocoon of crushed metal, the experience was different. The external noise became muffled, as if coming from far away. There was no immediate pain, only a state of suspension, a strange slowing of the world, where every detail seemed detached from time. Sophie clung tightly to Laura's arm, while Ethan stared at the side window, now opaque with pulverized glass. Richard still gripped the wheel, but he didn't feel the impact's pressure as he expected. Outside, people ran toward the wreck, some with hands on their heads, others with trembling phones trying to call emergency services. Truck drivers leapt from their cabs, exchanging quick, grim glances. A brief silence settled over the scene, the kind that precedes the confirmation of tragedy. And in that void, a question began to echo. How could anyone survive this? Some stories seem written by invisible hands. If you think this could be one, comment. It was a miracle. The outside world seemed to dissolve. The brutal sound of metal against metal, so deafening moments before, now reached them muted, as if from underwater. The air inside the car was warm but strangely light, and an almost tangible sensation spread through the cramped space. It was like being wrapped in an invisible blanket, dense, yet soft. Each Coleman felt, without needing to explain, that something, or someone, had entered that space. There was no flash of light, no voice, no visible image, just a presence, a silent force that didn't crush but sustained. Laura, without understanding, noticed her racing heart now beat in a calm rhythm. Sophie, who should have been crying, kept her eyes fixed on her mother's lap, as if borrowing her calm from the energy that filled the space. Ethan stared at his hands, wondering why they weren't trembling. It was as if the chaos was being filtered, blocked from crossing that barrier. The space between heartbeats felt longer. Richard felt the wheel under his fingers, but the pressure of the impact had vanished. Somewhere in his consciousness, a question arose. Why aren't we being crushed? The answer didn't come in words, but as an inner certainty that they were being held. It was something inexplicable, only recognized, like the instinct that tells you you're not alone. While the car's body crumpled under the force of the two trucks, the interior remained intact. No glass shards touched their bodies. No piece of metal invaded their space. The contrast was absurd. Total destruction outside, silence and untouchability inside. Later, Rescuers would call it impossible that not a single scratch marked the passengers. But in that moment, there was no logic. There was only the strange assurance that, whatever happened outside, it wouldn't reach them. And in that silence, something else stood out, the sense that time had stopped. Richard, who always believed every second was immutable, felt they were living a stretched moment, as if they'd been pulled from the normal flow of events. The road, the screams, the sound of the collision, all seemed distant, as if there were a layer between them and the rest of the world, a layer no one saw but everyone felt. When the final creak of metal ceased, the sensation lingered for a few more seconds. It was like being in the eye of a hurricane, where the wind doesn't reach and the ground feels steady, even as everything around collapses. And though none of them spoke in that moment, there was a shared, silent understanding. Something greater had placed itself between them and death, something that couldn't be explained by physics or engineering alone. Some experiences leave a lasting mark. If you've faced something that seemed impossible to overcome, but an invisible force worked in your favor, comment, "I lived this." Your memory might be the sign someone's waiting for. The roar subsided as if someone had closed a door to the outside world. The air, once vibrating with the echo of the collision, now felt heavy, laced with a strange silence broken only by the sound of quickened breaths. Outside, grey smoke rose like veils over the asphalt, mingling with the acrid smell of burnt oil and rubber. Distant sirens approached, and shouts came in fragments carried by the confusion of those running toward the scene. Inside the car, the scene was different. The air was dense but serene, as if the space had been sealed off from the surrounding chaos. Richard ran his hands over his body, searching for any pain, any sign of blood. He found nothing. He turned to Laura, who looked at him with a mix of shock and disbelief, and saw Sophie clinging to her mother's arm, eyes wide but dry. Ethan, hands resting on his knees, seemed dazed but unharmed. Slowly, each began to check themselves, almost like a silent pact of mutual verification. Hands ran over arms, shoulders, and faces, searching for cuts, scratches, marks. Nothing, not even glass shards. On the seats, the windshield, which should have been in pieces, was inexplicably intact. Even the side windows, though deformed from the outside, showed cracked but unshattered glass. It was as if time and the impact had been contained inside. The sound of sirens grew louder, mingling with the metallic clank of tools being prepared. Outside, voices shouted orders. "Cut here! Push back! Hold the door!" But none of it fully penetrated the bubble they were in. Richard looked through the glass and saw what he hadn't noticed before. The car was completely crushed, a compact mass of metal squeezed between two giants of cargo. Logic said no interior space could have survived, yet there they were, breathing. Richard's face paled, not from pain, but from the realization that this defied everything he believed. His hands, still on the wheel, trembled slightly. He looked at the ceiling, then the dashboard, as if searching the physical world for an answer to explain that impossible intactness. The only words he managed were in a low tone, almost a whisper to himself, This isn't possible." The words hung in the air, unanswered. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, as if wanting to absorb every second of that moment before someone opened the door and changed the scene. Sophie rested her forehead on her mother's shoulder, feeling the safe warmth enveloping her. Ethan, still silent, seemed to be memorizing every detail, as if he knew he'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand what had just happened. And while the outside world scrambled to rescue them, inside there was only a shared certainty. They had crossed something that wasn't just physical. An invisible barrier had protected them, and even if the coming hours were filled with questions, no technical answer would suffice to explain what really happened in that narrow space amid tons of twisted steel. The first fire truck arrived, its siren cutting through the smoke-heavy air. Men in helmets and uniforms, singed by the reflection of red lights, leapt from the vehicle already wielding hydraulic tools. The scene before them looked like a frozen frame of destruction. Two trucks fused as if one, with what was once a car, now just a twisted shell of metal and glass in between. By the laws of physics, no space could hold a human body intact, but they didn't know that behind that crushed barrier, something defied every rescue manual. The team leader quickly assessed the situation and gave orders. The cut would need to be made at two critical points to release the pressure between the vehicles. A hydraulic machine began working, the high-pitched sound of blades meeting resistance in the truck's thick metal. Sparks flew, and with every passing second, more onlookers gathered at the road's edges, trying to understand if there were survivors. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered that it was pointless to keep trying. But the firefighters pressed on, their focus fixed on the mission. The process was slow, almost suffocating for those watching. The metal parted centimeter by centimeter, revealing only indistinct shadows inside. Between each tool's strike, pauses came to reposition the blades, and in those pauses, the silence grew heavier. The smell of fuel intensified, mixed with the heat rising from the crushed engines. Any mistake could cause a critical leak, and everyone there knew it. Finally, after nearly half an hour of effort, the first gap opened. It wasn't enough to see clearly, but something stood out. No blood, no frantic movement, no telltale sounds of someone trapped in wreckage. A few more cuts, and the gap widened, letting a beam of light flood the interior. What appeared made one firefighter step back, brow furrowed. Inside what seemed a cocoon of deformed metal, 4 people sat, still but alive, faces intact, bodies without visible injuries, clothes free of bloodstains. Around them, the metal had molded as if pushed outward, creating a perfectly tight, almost precise space that prevented any contact with the crushing force of tons of steel. It was as if an invisible hand had drawn that protection. An older firefighter, his face hardened by decades of rescues, lowered his helmet and muttered, almost in a whisper, "This I've never seen." The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. His colleagues exchanged glances, and even some onlookers stopped murmuring, as if realizing that moment wasn't ordinary. There, before everyone, was something that couldn't be explained by technique, experience, or luck alone. It was as if that space between the trucks had become, for a few minutes, the safest place in the world. Luck or miracle? The road turned into a feed, and everyone gave it a name. What's yours? Share in the comments. The days following the accident carried a different kind of silence in the house. It wasn't the heavy silence of avoiding conversation, but the silence of those trying to digest something that didn't fit into the drawers of logic. Clothes went back into closets, dishes to the kitchen cabinet, and routine resumed its usual shape. But for Richard, every task came with an echo of what happened on that road. While washing his hands at the sink or locking the door before bed, flashes returned. The muffled sound of the impact, the pressure that vanished from his chest, the impossible space around the seats. It was as if an invisible question followed him from room to room. On the first night back home, Richard opened his laptop intending to catch up on emails. But without realizing it, the work tab gave way to a search. People miraculously saved from serious accidents. News articles, blogs, even amateur rescue videos popped up where the word miracle appeared unapologetically. He clicked each link like someone searching for clues, comparing accounts, analyzing photos. He found stories of survivors describing sensations much like his, a strong presence, the sense that time slowed, an impossible calm amid chaos. With each read, his skepticism seemed to lose a piece. Laura noticed the changes before he even mentioned them. She found her husband, who once changed the channel at the sight of a religious program, watching a documentary on near-death experiences. It wasn't passive consumption. Richard jotted down authors' names, dates, references. At one point, he mentioned wanting to understand, scientifically, what could explain that protection. But the way he said, scientifically, no longer carried the same weight. It was almost an excuse to dive deeper without admitting he was heading in a new direction. The topic began creeping into family conversations. At breakfast, Sophie asked if the accident's angel was still with them. Ethan, initially uneasy, shared that he couldn't stop thinking about not having a single scratch despite the side window shattering. Laura, without pushing, said maybe they'd experienced something that didn't need full understanding to be valued. The table, once avoiding the topic of faith, now made room for questions and theories. There was no consensus, but there was curiosity, and for Richard, that was already a huge step. One Sunday afternoon, while driving Sophie to a school activity, Richard parked in front of a simple building with a sign reading, "Life and Hope Community Sunday Services." He didn't go in. He stayed in the car, watching people arrive. Young, old, entire families. There was nothing extraordinary, but something in that ordinary scene stirred a strange feeling, as if he were watching from outside a place that suddenly might make sense to visit. He didn't mention it to Laura that day, but the idea lingered. A few days later, he finally stepped inside. He chose a pew near the door as if ready to leave at any moment. The service spoke of protection in times of danger, citing biblical and modern stories. Richard didn't sing or close his eyes, but he listened, and as he listened, he couldn't help but draw parallels to what they'd lived through. When he left, there was no declared conversion, but there was something new, the realization that maybe it wasn't coincidence, but care. From that moment, the house changed subtly. Debates about faith turned into exchanges of experiences, and the children's questions were met with less haste and more patience. What was once dismissed as irrelevant now gained time and attention. There were still no definitive answers, but there was a silent agreement among them all. What happened on that road was more than an accident avoided. It was a milestone, and milestones in life call for new paths. Sometimes a single day is enough to turn everything we believe upside down and open doors we swore to keep closed. If you've been through something that changed how you see the world, comment, "I lived this," and if you can, share in a few words what happened. Your story might inspire someone today. It was a night like so many others. The kitchen clock showed just past 8. The smell of homemade pasta sauce filled the house, and the yellow light of the lamp over the table cast a warm circle amid the darkness outside. The TV was off, the phones silent. For the first time since the accident, they were all seated together, unhurried, undistracted. Richard watched Laura serve the plates, Sophie helping with the glasses, and Ethan idly folding a napkin. That simple scene carried a different weight. Dinner began with light conversation, a comment about the school day, a laugh about the neighbor's dog, a compliment on the food. But as forkfuls alternated with quiet glances, Richard felt something growing inside him that he could no longer hold back. It wasn't obligation or protocol. It was an impulse from a new place, born in that morning of twisted metal and intact glass. Each time he looked at his family, he remembered the impossible circle that had enveloped them. And this time, he didn't want the moment to pass unrecognized. He set his fork down and extended his hands, first to Laura, then to the kids. The simple gesture made them exchange surprised glances. Sophie, without hesitation, placed her small hand over her father's. Ethan, a bit slower, followed. Laura watched him for a moment, then without a word squeezed his hand. The touch formed a physical but also silent bond, one none of them recalled feeling so strongly before. His voice came out low, almost trembling at first. There were no rehearsed lines, no elaborate words, just a sincere, raw, real thanks. He spoke of that day, of what could have happened but didn't. He said he didn't know how to explain it, but knew there was a reason they were all there, together, at that table. He asked for protection, not just for them, but to recognize the value of every day that followed. The prayer's simplicity made the air in the kitchen feel different, lighter, fuller. There were no signs in the sky, no voices from nowhere, but each felt something close and open at once. It was the closing of a cycle marked by doubt and the start of another, guided by a new awareness. They didn't know if they could call it faith, but they knew they were different somehow. And sometimes that's how miracles begin, not with spectacles, but with small decisions to acknowledge the invisible. The conversation resumed slowly, now softer, as if the prayer had tuned everything. Dinner ended unhurried, and before turning off the kitchen light, Richard looked at the table, the chairs, every detail. A memory flooded his mind, the sound of the impact, the presence that enveloped them, the perfect circle amid chaos. He smiled faintly, not at anyone in particular, but at the silent certainty he carried since that day. The certainty that somehow something greater had entered that car and never left. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't walking away unscathed, but realizing how fragile and precious every moment is. Life can change in a second, and we won't always have answers for the why or how. But if we're attentive, we'll recognize the signs that even in chaos there is care, and that in itself is reason to be grateful. Some stories aren't about proving anything, but about recognizing what was there all along. The Colemans didn't return from that road to display scars because there were none to show. They returned to carry in silence the mark of a care impossible to explain. Because when life presses from all sides and you still breathe, something or someone is holding the weight for you. And when a family is preserved against all odds, The whole world bows before the power of a love unseen but felt. New stories are coming. Click the video below and dive into the next emotion. Until then.